Good evening. I'm Captain Marcus Brooks. After 28 years in the skies, I thought I'd seen every kind of passenger. I was wrong. Tonight, let me tell you what happened on Flight 512, Houston to New York, 6:15 departure, first class, nearly full. The gate area at Bush Intercontinental buzzed with the ordinary chaos of an evening flight. Businessmen checking watches, a family herding two toddlers, a gate agent calling boarding groups over the intercom. Dr. Elijah Ward stood near the window, watching the aircraft being fueled on the tarmac below. He wore a plain gray hoodie and worn sneakers, a leather doctor's bag slung over one shoulder, its strap frayed from years of use. He'd come straight from a 16-hour shift at Memorial Trauma Center, and it showed in the shadows under his eyes and the slow, deliberate way he moved, the walk of a man conserving whatever energy he had left. When his group was called, he stepped up and handed his boarding pass to Vivian Cross, the lead flight attendant working the forward cabin that night. Vivian had 11 years with the airline, sharp instincts about turbulence and difficult passengers, and a private set of assumptions about who fit where that she had never once been asked to examine. She looked at the pass, then at him, then back at the pass. Seat 2A, first class. "Sir, this is the premium cabin," she said, in the tone people use when they expect someone to already know they don't belong. "Coach boarding is through the back, past the second checkpoint." "I know," Elijah said, his voice even, tired but not annoyed. "That's my seat, 2A. Vivian didn't move to scan it. "Can I see some ID with that?" It wasn't standard. Boarding passes were scanned, not cross-checked with identification, unless something triggered a manual review. Elijah knew that. He'd flown enough to know exactly how boarding worked. He also knew better than to make a scene about it at 6 in the evening with a line building behind him. "Sure," he said. "It's in my bag. Give me a second." Passengers behind him began to shift and murmur, the particular restlessness of people who just want to get to their seats. A man in a Navy suit, Grant Holloway, stepped around Elijah entirely, boarding pass already raised. "2B right here," Grant said cheerfully, flashing an easy smile. Vivian smiled back, scanned it without a second look, and waved him through with a warm, "Welcome aboard, sir. Can I get you something to drink once we're settled?" Elijah was still standing there, unzipping the front pocket of his bag, pass in hand. "My ID is right here." "Sir, I need you to step aside so we can keep boarding," Vivian said, already looking past him toward the next passenger. "I'll need to verify this reservation before I can seat you." He stepped aside without argument, moving to the wall beside the galley and waited. 12 people boarded past him in the next several minutes. An elderly couple, a woman in running shoes and yoga pants, a college student in a stained sweatshirt. None of them stopped. None of them asked for a second form of identification. He watched his own seat number sit empty and unclaimed on the cabin display screen behind Vivian's shoulder, watched other passengers settle into the seats around it, while he stood against the wall like a man waiting to be granted permission to exist in a space he had already paid for. He noticed all of it. He always did. 20 years of moments like this one had taught him exactly how to catalog them without letting his face show a thing. When Vivian finally pulled up the manifest on her handheld scanner, the name matched immediately. Elijah Ward, seat 2A, ticketed same day, priority boarding, medical professional discount fare. She read it twice, the way people read something they don't want to be true, as if a third look might change the letters on the screen. "You can board now," she said without apology, already turning to greet the next passenger with a brighter voice than the one she'd used on him. Elijah walked to his seat and sat down without a word, sliding his bag beneath the seat in front of him with practiced care, the way a man handles something he can't afford to damage. Across the aisle, Grant Holloway was already being offered a pre-departure drink, a glass of sparkling water with a twist of lime balanced on a small napkin. Elijah was not offered one. He didn't ask. He closed his eyes and let his head rest against the window, and within minutes, exhaustion pulled him toward sleep. 40 minutes into the flight, the seatbelt sign chimed on hard. No warning, no gentle build. The aircraft dropped, then dropped again, harder, the kind of jolt that sends unsecured cups flying and turns quiet conversation into sharp intakes of breath. Overhead bins rattled against their latches. A woman 2 rows back gasped and grabbed the armrest. In row 4, an elderly man named Walter Pierce slumped sideways against the window, his coffee cup tumbling into the aisle and rolling until it struck a shoe. His wife Doris grabbed his arm, her wedding ring catching the cabin light. Walter, look at me." He didn't answer. His head lolled slightly, his lips beginning to turn a shade of gray that Doris had never seen on him in 41 years of marriage. "We need a doctor," Doris called out, her voice cracking down the middle. "Somebody please help him." Vivian froze for half a second, reaching automatically for the intercom to page for medical help through the cabin speakers, the standard procedure drilled into every flight attendant. Before she finished lifting the handset, Elijah was already out of his seat, moving down the narrow aisle against the shaking of the aircraft, one hand braced against the seat backs to keep his balance. "I'm a physician," he said, already crouching beside Walter's seat. "Let me through." Vivian hesitated, some old reflex rising in her even now. "Sir, I need to verify." "There's no time for that," Elijah said, his hands already moving, checking Walter's pulse at the wrist, tilting his chin to check the airway. "Get me the medical kit and the AED. Now, please." Something in his tone, absolute, unshaken, cut straight through whatever hesitation she was holding on to. She moved, fast, pulling the red kit down from the overhead compartment and the defibrillator case from beneath the jump seat. Elijah checked Walter's pulse, listened to his breathing with 2 fingers pressed against his throat, lifted his eyelids, all within seconds. The practiced economy of a man who had done this hundreds of times in an emergency room. "Possible cardiac event," he said, loud enough for the crew to hear clearly. "I need the kit open, the aisle cleared, and someone getting the captain on the radio for a priority medical diversion assessment." Doris was crying quietly now, both hands pressed to her mouth. Elijah kept his voice low and steady, speaking to her as much as to Walter, the way he'd learned to speak to frightened families over 15 years of practice. "You're doing fine, Walter. Stay with me. Doris, I need you to hold his hand and keep talking to him. Tell him about your grandkids, anything familiar. That helps more than you know." Grant Holloway leaned across the aisle, craning his neck. "Is he going to be okay? Should we land somewhere?" "Sit back, please, and give us room," Elijah said, not unkindly, but with total focus, never breaking rhythm. For the next 11 minutes, while the aircraft found smoother air above the weather system, Elijah worked without pause. He administered chewable aspirin from the kit, monitored Walter's pulse and breathing at steady intervals, relayed clear instructions through the crew to ground-based medical control over the radio, and kept Doris calm with short, honest updates delivered between checks. Not once did he raise his voice. Not once did his hands shake. "I remember getting the call up front myself. A physician on board had stabilized a suspected cardiac patient and was requesting priority landing clearance into New York, with EMS standing by at the gate. I diverted our approach path and radioed ahead immediately. That single request from row 4 likely saved Walter Pierce's life that night." When the aircraft leveled out and Walter's colors slowly returned, his breathing steadying into something closer to normal, Elijah finally sat back on his heels, breathing hard himself, the adrenaline draining out all at once the way it always did after. Doris grabbed his hand with both of hers. "Thank you," she whispered, tears streaming freely now. "Thank you, thank you. I don't know what we would have done." Vivian stood a few feet away in the aisle, holding the emptied medical kit against her chest, watching the man she had made wait at the boarding door 20 minutes into their flight, now kneeling on the floor of her cabin, having just kept another passenger alive with his bare hands, and a lifetime of training nobody at that door had thought to ask him about. Elijah returned to his seat once ground medical control confirmed Walter was stable enough to remain seated with continuous monitoring until landing. He was quiet, drained the way doctors get after a save, the adrenaline draining out all at once and leaving something hollow behind it. He didn't ask for recognition. He didn't ask for anything at all. He asked for water, and even that came out barely above a whisper. Vivian brought it to him herself, kneeling slightly beside his seat instead of simply reaching across. That was, "Thank you. Really, I don't think I've ever seen anyone move that fast." "You're welcome," Elijah said simply, taking the water and drinking half of it in one motion. She lingered a moment longer than she needed to, some part of her wanting to say more, unsure exactly what. Then she went back to her galley station and pulled out the standard post-incident report form, required for any in-flight medical event, regardless of outcome. She wrote what procedure required, physician identity, credentials if available, actions taken, patient outcome, timestamps for each stage of the response. It was thorough. It was also, in a way she didn't examine closely, still colored by the same instinct that had made her ask for his ID at the boarding door 40 minutes earlier. When she reached the line for credentials, her pen hovered for a moment. She had watched him work. She had watched him save a man's life with total command of the situation. And still, some old habit made her write, passenger self-identified as physician, credentials unconfirmed at time of incident. It was technically accurate. No license had been physically shown to her mid-emergency, and procedure didn't require one to be. But accuracy and honesty aren't always the same thing, and somewhere underneath the correct wording sat the same quiet demand for proof that had kept Elijah standing at a door while 12 other passengers walked past him. She didn't know yet that Elijah Ward's name was already sitting in an email thread in the airline's corporate inbox, forwarded that same afternoon by the Vice President of Flight Operations, Renata Cole, to 3 members of her leadership team with the subject line, "Confirmed for tomorrow, 9 a.m., signing." Elijah was the lead physician consultant the airline had spent 8 months courting for its new onboard emergency response partnership, a program designed to pair every flight crew nationwide with a network of on-call physicians who could guide in-air medical emergencies in real time. He was flying to New York, not for vacation, and not by coincidence, but for the final signing meeting the next morning, the one that would make his trauma center the official pilot hospital for the entire initiative. He hadn't mentioned any of this on the flight. He never did, not on any flight, not with any stranger. He'd learned a long time ago that titles changed the way people treated him almost instantly, the way a single word could rearrange a room. So more often than he'd ever admit out loud, he chose to travel without volunteering his, just to see, honestly, how people treated a man with nothing but a tired face and a worn bag. Tonight, he'd gotten his answer at the boarding door before he'd ever needed a title at all. And again, in a quieter and stranger way, the moment Vivian's pen touched that credentials line, without her even fully realizing what she was writing. The next morning, Renata Cole sat at the head of a conference table on the 22nd floor of the airline's New York headquarters, sunlight cutting across a stack of binders and a signing folder with the partnership logo embossed on the front. 8 months of negotiations came down to this room, this morning, this signature. Elijah walked in wearing a charcoal suit this time, his doctor's bag replaced by a slim leather folio, the exhaustion from the night before mostly gone from his face, though not entirely. "Dr. Ward, thank you for making the trip," Renata said, standing and shaking his hand warmly. "I hope the flight was smooth. Long day for you already, I imagine, before we've even started." "It was eventful," Elijah said, taking the seat across from her. "One of your passengers had a cardiac event about 40 minutes into the flight. He's stable now. EMS met us at the gate in New York." Renata's expression shifted, the polite professional warmth giving way to something sharper. "Wait, that was your flight? Flight 512, last night?" "That was my flight." She reached for her tablet, pulling up the incident report that had already been filed and routed overnight, standard practice for any in-air medical event across the fleet. She scanned it quickly, her eyes moving down the page, then stopped hard on one line near the bottom. Passenger self-identified as physician. Credentials unconfirmed at time of incident. She looked up slowly. "This says your credentials were unconfirmed." Elijah didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, just answered with the same steadiness he'd used on Doris in row 4. "They were never asked for. Once I was already treating the patient. There wasn't time, and there shouldn't have been. Before that, though, at boarding, I was asked for ID while another passenger in the same cabin, same section, was waved through without a second glance." Renata's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She scrolled to the bottom of the report and read the flight attendant's name signed at the base of the document, Vivian Cross. She recognized it immediately, the same crew member scheduled to work the return leg of Flight 512 that very evening. "Dr. Ward, I want to be direct with you because I think you deserve that more than a polished apology," she said, setting the tablet down. "This partnership only works if our physicians trust that our crews will treat them with respect from the moment they step on the aircraft, not just once an emergency proves who they are. What you're describing is the opposite of what we've spent 8 months building toward." "I agree completely," Elijah said, "which is exactly why I think you should read the whole file, the boarding footage included, before either of us signs anything today." He wasn't threatening to walk away from the deal, and his tone made that clear. He simply wasn't going to let the morning move forward without her actually looking at what had happened, not just at the parts of the story that were convenient to a signing ceremony. Renata pulled the full boarding footage from the gate cameras that same afternoon, sitting alone in a small viewing room with the door closed. She watched Elijah wait at the jet bridge door, minute after minute, while a steady stream of passengers moved past him toward the aircraft. She watched Grant Holloway wave a boarding pass and get smiled through without a second glance, a warm greeting, an offer of a drink before he'd even sat down. She watched Vivian's face on the recording, close enough on the gate camera to read her expression clearly, and recognized something in it that unsettled her more than outright hostility would have. Not cruelty exactly, but a kind of quiet certainty that didn't need facts to feel confirmed, the sort of certainty that never even noticed it was operating. She called Vivian into her office the next morning, the door closed, 2 cups of coffee going cold on the desk between them. "Walk me through boarding on Flight 512, Renata said, keeping her tone even, giving Vivian room to explain herself honestly. Vivian explained the ID check the way she'd explained it in the report. framing it as standard diligence, a busy boarding process, nothing personal, just being careful during a hectic 6 o'clock departure with a full cabin. Did you ask anyone else in that cabin for ID that evening? Any of the other 11 or 12 first-class passengers? Vivian paused, running the boarding sequence back through her memory, already sensing where this was headed. No, but that wasn't about... I watched the footage, Vivian, the whole boarding sequence, start to finish. Renata's voice stayed level, but there was no give in it. 12 passengers boarded while Dr. Ward stood against that galley wall. Not one of them was asked to prove a single thing about who they were. Vivian was quiet, her hands wrapped around the coffee cup she hadn't touched. He saved a passenger's life 40 minutes later, Renata continued. Performed CPR-level intervention, coordinated with ground medical control, kept a terrified woman's husband alive at 35,000 feet, and your report still described his credentials as unconfirmed, even after every person on that aircraft had just watched him work with their own eyes. I need you to answer me honestly, not for a personnel file, just for yourself. If he'd been wearing a suit at that door instead of a hoodie, would you have asked for ID? Vivian opened her mouth to defend herself, then closed it. The honest answer sat heavy in the room, and she found she didn't have the words to soften it, so for once, she didn't try to. No, she finally said quietly. I probably wouldn't have. I didn't even think about it in the moment. That's what scares me now, saying it out loud. Renata didn't fire her. She didn't want a headline out of this, and she didn't believe punishment alone changed anything. She wanted an actual fix, something that outlasted one uncomfortable meeting. She required Vivian to complete a full retraining program on the airline's boarding equity standards, personally rewrote the incident report to reflect the full and accurate sequence of events, and arranged for the airline to issue a direct apology to Elijah before the partnership signing moved forward. Elijah listened to the apology when it came, measured and sincere, then asked one question that mattered more to him than the words themselves. What actually changes so this doesn't happen to the next doctor who doesn't look like what people expect a doctor to look like? Renata had already been thinking about exactly that. She proposed a new boarding protocol company-wide, identification checks applied consistently to every passenger in a cabin, or to none at all, logged automatically through the scanning system instead of left to a single crew member's in-the-moment judgment call. She also asked Elijah to help design the training module himself, since he understood the blind spot from the inside, in a way no policy consultant ever could. He agreed, on one condition. Walter Pierce's case would be used, fully anonymized, as the opening example in that training module, not to shame anyone by name, but so every future crew member walked away understanding exactly what had almost been missed in those first 20 minutes at a boarding door, and exactly what it had cost to fix it after the fact instead of getting it right from the start. 3 months later, Elijah boarded Flight 512 again, same route, same 6:15 departure, wearing the exact same gray hoodie and worn sneakers he'd worn the first time. He did it on purpose, a small, quiet test of his own, one he didn't mention to anyone at the airline beforehand. At the door, a different flight attendant checked his pass, then checked the passenger boarding just behind him, then the one after that. Same questions, same even tone, roughly 3 seconds each, no variation from one traveler to the next. No pause when it was his turn, no second look at his sneakers, no request for a form of ID that no one else in the cabin was asked to produce. Just a scan, a smile, and, "Welcome aboard, Dr. Ward. Seat 2A is on your right." Vivian was working the flight too, reassigned temporarily to galley coordination duties as part of her retraining rotation, a decision she hadn't fought. When she saw him board, she came forward before he'd even reached his seat, setting down the tray she'd been holding. "Dr. Ward, I owe you a real apology, not the version that came out of a policy meeting with lawyers reviewing every word beforehand." She met his eyes directly. "I judged you before I knew a single thing about you, and I told myself in the moment that it was just procedure. It wasn't. I'm sorry, genuinely, not because I was told to be." Elijah studied her for a moment, the same unhurried, assessing look he probably gave patients before delivering a diagnosis. Procedure protects everyone the same way, or it isn't procedure at all. It's just an excuse wearing a uniform. But I appreciate you saying that yourself, in your own words, and not because someone handed you a script. She nodded, and for the first time since that first boarding, she didn't look away from him. 40 minutes later, no one needed a doctor. Walter Pierce wasn't on that flight. He was home in Houston, recovering well, according to a card Doris had mailed to Elijah's office 2 weeks earlier. Nothing dramatic happened on Flight 512 that evening at all, and Elijah found himself genuinely grateful for that. A boring flight, a quiet cabin where nobody had to prove they belonged before they were allowed to help, or even before they were allowed to simply sit down. I met Dr. Ward briefly at the gate that night, after we'd landed, shook his hand, and thanked him personally for what he'd done for our emergency response program and for Walter Pierce specifically. He told me something I haven't forgotten since. He said the scariest moment of that whole ordeal wasn't the turbulence, and it wasn't Walter's heart stumbling in row 4. It was standing at a boarding door with a completely valid ticket in his hand, watching a stranger decide who he was before he'd ever gotten the chance to say it himself. At 35,000 feet, every single one of us breathes the same recycled air, drinks from the same galley cart, buckles the same kind of belt. It's character, not the clothes someone happens to be wearing at the door, that tells you who's actually going to save your life when it counts most. I'm Captain Marcus Brooks. Thanks for flying with me tonight. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. There's another flight waiting.